The candles on the long dining table shook when the Duke of Morland brought his fist down and laughed so hard that wine spilled from his glass onto the white cloth. Eleanor Whitmore sat frozen at the far end of the table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face burning under the eyes of 12 guests who had all turned to stare at her. "Where would she go?" the Duke repeated, wiping his eyes as if the question itself were the funniest thing he had heard in years. "Tell me, Cousin Henry, have you ever met a woman with less family, less money, and less sense than our dear Eleanor? She has no home but this one, no name worth speaking. If I threw her out this very night, she would be sleeping in a ditch by morning." The guests laughed along with him, some out of true amusement, others out of fear of being the one who did not laugh. Eleanor kept her eyes on the tablecloth. She had learned, over 3 long years in this house, that looking up only invited more cruelty. The Duke enjoyed an audience. He fed on reactions the way other men fed on food and drink. She was not truly his wife, not in the way the world understood the word, though she wore his ring and answered to his name in public. She was his ward turned unwanted burden, brought into the household after her father's death left her with debts instead of an inheritance. The marriage had been arranged quickly and quietly, a favor called in by a family friend who had since passed away, leaving Eleanor alone with a man who saw her as nothing more than proof of his own generosity, a charity case he could mock whenever he wished to feel powerful. "Perhaps," said Henry Blackwood, the Duke's cousin, in a voice that tried and failed to sound light, "she has more resources than you think, Edmund." The Duke waved a hand dismissively. "Resources? What resources? A trunk of old dresses and a head full of foolish dreams. No, if she left this house she would have nowhere to turn. Nowhere at all. I am the only reason she has not starved." He said this often, in different words, at different tables, in front of different guests. It was his favorite performance, and Eleanor had become the prop he used to prove his own importance. Tonight, though, something in his tone was sharper than usual, more final, as though he were not merely mocking her but warning her, reminding her of exactly how small her world had become. What the Duke did not know, what he could never have imagined as he sat at the head of his table laughing at a woman he believed powerless, was that the servants who filled his glass, who lit his candles, who pressed his coats and prepared his meals, had been watching him for years with a very different kind of attention. They had watched him humiliate Eleanor in front of strangers. They had watched her carry his cruelty with a straight back and a silent mouth. And in the quiet hours when the Duke was asleep or away at his club, they had begun, slowly and carefully, to do something about it. At that very moment, while the Duke laughed and the guests toasted his wit, a small leather trunk sat half hidden beneath a cot in the servants' quarters at the top of the house. It did not belong to any servant. It belonged to Eleanor, though she did not yet know it was there, and it was not empty. Margaret Hale, the housekeeper who had served the Morland family for over 20 years, was the one who had carried the trunk up the back stairs 3 nights earlier, wrapped in an old blanket so no one passing in the hallway would recognize its shape. Margaret had been in this house longer than the Duke himself had been master of it. She remembered his father, a harder but somehow fairer man, and she remembered the young Eleanor who had first arrived at Morland Hall, thin and quiet and grieving, with nothing but a small case of her father's letters and a locket that had belonged to her mother. Margaret had watched that quiet, grieving girl grow into a quiet, suffering woman, and something in her had refused to accept it any longer. Down in the dining hall, the laughter began to fade as the guests turned their attention back to their plates and their wine, and the Duke, satisfied with the reaction he had earned, returned to his meal as though nothing of consequence had happened at all. For him, it truly hadn't. It was simply another evening, another joke, another small cruelty tossed out like a scrap to a dog, forgotten the moment it left his mouth. For Eleanor, it was different. Each laugh, each repetition of that same cold question, cut a little deeper than the one before. She excused herself as soon as she was able, murmuring something about a headache, and walked from the dining room with as much dignity as she could gather, feeling the eyes of the guests follow her all the way to the door. Once she was in the hallway, out of sight of the table, her composure cracked. She pressed a hand against the cool stone wall and closed her eyes, breathing slowly, forcing back the tears that had gathered but refused, out of stubborn pride, to fall. She had promised herself, on the night she arrived at Morland Hall 3 years ago, that she would never let this house see her cry. It was one of the only promises she had managed to keep. She made her way up the grand staircase, past portraits of Morland ancestors who stared down at her with painted indifference, and did not stop until she reached the smaller, plainer staircase that led to her own chamber, a modest room on the second floor that had once belonged to a governess. The Duke had placed her there deliberately, she suspected, to remind her daily of her true position in the household, far from the grander rooms reserved for a proper wife. As she reached the landing, she nearly collided with Alice Grant, one of the younger housemaids, who was carrying a stack of folded linens, and startled so badly at the sight of her that she nearly dropped them all. "Forgive me, ma'am," Alice said quickly, steadying the linens against her chest. Her eyes, Elinor noticed, were wide and strangely bright, darting for just a moment toward the narrow staircase that led up to the servants' quarters before returning to Elinor's face. "I did not hear you coming." "It is only me, Alice. No need to apologize." Elinor managed a small, tired smile. "You look as though you have seen a ghost." "No, ma'am, only tired, that is all." "Long day." Alice dropped a quick, nervous curtsy and hurried away down the hall, leaving Elinor standing alone on the landing, faintly puzzled but too weary to think much of it. She did not know, could not have known, that Alice had spent the last hour helping to carry folded gowns, a warm shawl, and a small collection of personal items up to that hidden trunk, working under Margaret's careful direction, terrified the entire time that she would be caught and dismissed without a reference, or worse. Elinor continued to her room and shut the door behind her, leaning against it for a long moment before crossing to the small window that overlooked the dark gardens below. The moon was rising over the hedges, casting long silver shadows across the lawn, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out into the night. She thought, as she often did in these quiet moments, of her father, of the small house they had shared before his death, of a life that had once felt full of warmth and possibility. She thought too, though she tried not to, of the years stretching ahead of her in this house, years of dinners like the one she had just endured, years of being the joke at the Duke's table, the woman with nowhere to go. It was a thought that had settled into her chest like a stone, heavy and familiar, and she had long ago stopped fighting it, believing there was simply nothing to be done. What she did not know was that, just above her head, in the narrow rooms beneath the roof where the servants slept, a quiet conspiracy had already begun to take shape, one that would change everything she believed about her place in the world, and about the people who surrounded her every single day without her ever truly seeing them. Margaret Hale sat that night by a single candle in her small room, going over a short list written in her own careful hand. Names of coaching inns along the northern road. The address of a distant cousin of Elinor's late mother, a woman named Constance Ashworth who lived in a quiet market town 2 days' journey from Morland Hall, a woman Margaret had written to in secret 3 weeks earlier, and whose reply, folded now inside Margaret's apron pocket, promised a warm welcome and a safe home for as long as it might be needed. Margaret had not told Elinor about the letter. Not yet. She had learned in her years of service that plans made too early were plans that could unravel, whispered accidentally in the wrong corridor, overheard by the wrong pair of ears. The Duke kept a steward, a thin, watchful man named Walter Grimshaw, who reported every strange movement in the household directly to his master, and who had a talent for appearing in doorways exactly when he was least wanted. It was Grimshaw's presence, more than anything else, that made the growing plan so dangerous. Margaret knew that if he so much as suspected what was being arranged beneath his master's roof, he would carry the news to the Duke before the sun had fully risen, and whatever small hope they had built for Elinor would be crushed before it ever had the chance to breathe. And so the trunk stayed hidden, the letters stayed folded, and the household continued its quiet, careful work in the only hours it dared to do so, deep in the night, long after the Duke of Morland had gone to bed still laughing, in his own mind, at the perfect joke he believed he had made at dinner. He had no idea that his laughter had reached ears far beyond the dining table, that it had traveled up through the walls of his own house, and settled into the hearts of the very people he trusted to serve him without question. He had no idea that his cruelty, repeated one time too many, had finally pushed a quiet, weary household past its breaking point. He believed, as he always believed, that Eleanor Whitmore had nowhere to go. He was about to learn, in the most unexpected way, exactly how wrong a man could be. 3 days after the dinner, the Duke of Morland called for his solicitor to visit Morland Hall, and the entire household felt the shift in the air before a single word was spoken. Servants who had worked in grand houses long enough could read the mood of a master the way sailors read the sky before a storm, and something about the Duke's manner that morning, brisk, satisfied, almost gleeful, told Margaret Hale that trouble was coming faster than she had expected. She learned the truth of it that evening from Charles Pratt, the footman who had served drinks in the study, while the solicitor and the Duke discussed matters behind closed doors. Charles was a careful young man, quiet by nature, who had perfected the skill of appearing invisible while carrying trays and refilling glasses, a skill that made him an excellent listener in a house full of secrets. He found Margaret in the kitchen after the last of the dinner dishes had been cleared, and he spoke to her in a low voice, glancing toward the door as though the walls themselves might report his words back to the Duke. "He means to send for a bishop's clerk," Charles said. "I heard him say it plainly. He wants the marriage set aside quietly on some paper reason or another, so that he might marry Miss Caroline Redfern before the year is out. He said Eleanor could be settled somewhere small, out of the way, with a little money, just enough to keep her from becoming a scandal." Margaret set down the cup she had been drying and stared at him. He said this to his solicitor, plainly. Plainly and laughing while he said it, he called it a tidy arrangement, said no one would question it given her lack of family to object. Charles hesitated, then added, "He means to move quickly, Margaret, before the month is out from what I understood." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had known the Duke to be cruel in his words, careless in his teasing, indifferent to Eleanor's feelings in ways that had angered her for years. But this was different. This was not mere cruelty spoken across a dinner table for the amusement of guests. This was a plan, a deliberate scheme to discard a woman who had done nothing wrong except lose her father and find herself, through no fault of her own, married into a house that never wanted her. "Does she know?" Margaret asked. Charles shook his head. "Not yet, I think. She was in the garden when I came down. I do not believe anyone has told her." Margaret pressed her lips together, thinking quickly. She had already begun preparing a plan, slow and careful, meant to give Eleanor a safe path away from Morland Hall whenever the time felt right. But a month was no longer enough time to be careful. If the Duke intended to set the marriage aside and send Eleanor away with nothing but a small allowance and a ruined reputation, then the household would need to move far faster than Margaret had hoped. "We will need help," she said finally, "more than we have." It was Alice Grant who suggested speaking to Oliver Finch, the young man who drove the Duke's carriage and who had, over the past year, developed a quiet and respectful fondness for Eleanor that had never once crossed into anything improper, but which had made him fiercely protective of her all the same. Oliver had grown up in the north, in a town not far from where Eleanor's cousin Constance now lived, and he knew every road, every coaching inn, every shortcut between Morland Hall and the safety of a place the Duke's influence could not easily reach. Margaret found him the next morning in the stables, brushing down the horses with the same steady care he gave to every task, and she told him, in careful and measured words, what Charles had overheard the night before. Oliver's hands stilled on the horse's flank, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, his jaw tight with an anger he clearly did not trust himself to speak aloud. "When does he mean to move?" Oliver asked finally. "Within the month. Perhaps sooner if the clerk arrives quickly." "Then we cannot wait for the month to pass." Oliver set down the brush and looked at Margaret directly. "I can have the carriage ready on short notice. I know the road to Ashworth's house well enough to travel it in the dark if I must, but she will need somewhere safe the very night she leaves, not days later. A coaching inn along the main road is too easy to trace. The Duke has friends in every town between here and the border." Margaret nodded slowly, turning the problem over in her mind. "There is a smaller road further west that the mail coaches use. It adds half a day to the journey, but fewer people would think to look for her there." "Then that is the road we take." It was decided, in that quiet stable on an ordinary morning, that the plan would no longer wait for a perfect moment. It would happen soon, likely within the week, the moment the household judged it safe enough to attempt. But there remained one great difficulty that none of them had yet solved. Alina herself did not know any of this was happening. She did not know about the trunk hidden beneath the servants' cots. She did not know about Constance's letter, folded carefully in Margaret's apron. She did not know that the Duke intended to discard her before the month was through, replacing her quietly with a woman more suited, in his eyes, to the position of Duchess. And there remained, too, the ever-present danger of Walter Grimshaw, who had a habit of appearing in corridors precisely when he was least wanted, and who Margaret suspected had already begun to sense that something in the household was different, though he could not yet say what. That suspicion proved correct sooner than anyone hoped. 2 days after Margaret's conversation with Oliver in the stables, Grimshaw found reason to visit the upper floor of the servants' quarters, claiming he had come to inspect a leak in the roof that had been reported the week before. Alice Grant, who happened to be folding linens in the hallway when he arrived, felt her heart lurch painfully in her chest as she watched him move slowly down the narrow corridor, his sharp eyes drifting toward the closed door of the small storage room where the trunk had been hidden beneath an old cot. "Is something wrong, Mr. Grimshaw?" Alice asked, forcing her voice to remain steady and light, though her hands trembled slightly against the folded sheets. Grimshaw turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "There was a report of water coming through the ceiling. I mean to see it for myself." "The leak is in the far room, sir, past the linen closet. This room here holds only old furniture and broken things not worth the trouble of throwing out." Alice gestured toward a different door entirely, one that led to a genuinely unused storage space at the opposite end of the corridor, praying silently that her voice did not betray the fear rising in her chest. Grimshaw studied her for a long moment, and Alice felt certain in that terrible pause that he could see straight through her words to the truth hidden just a few feet away. But whatever suspicion passed through his mind, he said nothing of it, only gave a short nod and turned to follow her toward the room she had indicated, inspecting the ceiling there with the same careful attention he gave to everything in the house that belonged, in his mind, to the Duke. He left a short while later, apparently satisfied, but Alice did not feel her heartbeat return to normal until she had watched him descend the main staircase and disappear from view entirely. She hurried immediately to find Margaret, breathless with the near miss, and the two women agreed, without needing to say it aloud, that the household's time for careful, slow planning had run out completely. Meanwhile, Alina continued through her days with no awareness of the danger closing in around her from 2 directions at once: the Duke's cold scheme on one side, and the desperate, secret efforts to save her on the other. She spent her mornings walking in the gardens, her afternoons reading quietly in the small sitting room she had claimed as her own, and her evenings enduring dinners that had grown, if anything, slightly less cruel in recent days, though she did not understand why. She did not know that the Duke's lessened interest in mocking her stemmed simply from his growing focus on Caroline Redfern. The young woman he intended to marry once Alina was safely out of the way. She did not know that his solicitor had already begun drawing up papers. She did not know that somewhere above her head, in rooms she rarely visited, a household of people she had long assumed were indifferent to her fate had been risking their own positions, their own safety, for weeks, simply to give her a chance at a life beyond these walls. It was Margaret who finally decided that the silence could no longer continue. Alina deserved to know the truth, both the danger she faced and the help that had been quietly building around her, before the household moved any further in its plans. And so, on a quiet evening while the Duke dined out with friends, Margaret climbed the stairs to Eleanor's small chamber, carrying with her a single candle and a heart full of words she had rehearsed for days but still did not feel fully ready to speak. She knocked softly on the door, and when Eleanor's gentle voice bid her enter, Margaret stepped inside, closed the door quietly behind her, and began to speak the truth that would change everything Eleanor believed about her place in this house, and about the people she had never truly known were watching over her all along. Eleanor set down her book the moment Margaret entered, sensing at once that something was different about the older woman's manner. In 3 years, Margaret had never once come to her chamber uninvited, and certainly never with the careful, guarded expression she wore now, like someone carrying something fragile and dangerous at the same time. "Margaret, is something wrong?" "May I sit, ma'am?" Margaret's voice was quiet, and Eleanor noticed her hands were pressed together tightly in front of her apron, as though she needed them still to keep from trembling. "Of course, please." Eleanor gestured to the chair beside the small fireplace, her curiosity quickly turning into a low, uneasy worry. "You are frightening me a little, Margaret." Margaret lowered herself into the chair and was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words with obvious care. "I have served this house for over 20 years, Miss Eleanor. I knew the old Duke, may he rest peacefully, and I have watched his son grow into the man he is today. I say this only so you understand that what I am about to tell you does not come from idle gossip or foolish worry. It comes from things I have seen and heard with my own eyes and ears, from people in this house I trust completely." Eleanor's hands had gone still in her lap. "Tell me." And so Margaret told her. She spoke of the solicitor's visit, of the words Charles had overheard through the study door, of the Duke's plan to have the marriage quietly set aside on some legal pretense, of his intention to marry Caroline Redfern before the year was through, and of the small, humiliating allowance he meant to offer Eleanor in exchange for disappearing quietly from his life, out of the way, out of sight, out of scandal. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her face growing paler with every word, until by the time Margaret finished speaking, she sat perfectly still, staring into the small fire as though she could no longer feel the room around her. "He means to discard me," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like an old coat he has grown tired of wearing. I am so sorry, ma'am. I did not want to be the one to tell you such a thing, but I could not let it happen to you without warning and without hope." Eleanor looked up sharply at the word hope, something flickering behind her eyes that had not been there a moment before. "Hope? What hope is there, Margaret? You heard him yourself at the dinner table not a week ago. Where would I go? I have no family, no money of my own, nowhere in this world that would take me in." It was then that Margaret told her the rest, and this second part of her confession seemed to steady her nerves rather than shake them further, as though the danger she had already spoken made the courage to speak of the plan somehow easier to find. She told Eleanor of the letter to Constance Ashworth, Eleanor's mother's cousin, a woman Eleanor barely remembered but who had responded to Margaret's careful inquiry with immediate warmth and an open invitation to come stay for as long as needed. She told her of the trunk hidden beneath a cot in the servants' quarters, packed slowly and carefully over recent weeks with clothing, a little money gathered quietly from the household staff who had each contributed what small amount they could spare, and a few personal items Margaret had gathered from Eleanor's own room when she knew Eleanor would not notice their absence. A locket, a set of old letters from her father, small things that mattered more than their size suggested. She told her of Oliver Finch, who had already mapped the safest road north, one that avoided the main coaching routes where the Duke's friends and acquaintances might recognize a fleeing woman traveling alone. She told her of Alice's near encounter with Grimshaw 2 days before, and how close their careful secret had come to being discovered. By the time Margaret finished, tears had gathered in Eleanor's eyes, though these were tears entirely different from the ones she had swallowed at countless dinner tables over the years. These were tears of overwhelming disbelief, of a gratitude so large it felt almost too heavy to hold inside her chest. "You did all of this," Eleanor said softly, "without ever telling me. We did not want to give you hope only to have it taken away, ma'am. if the plan could not be made safe in time. And we did not want to risk you being questioned by the Duke or by Mr. Grimshaw before everything was ready. It seemed safer, cruel as it may sound, for you to know nothing until we were certain. Elinor rose from her chair and crossed the small room to the window, looking out over the dark garden below, the same garden she had stared into so many times, feeling utterly alone in this enormous, cold house. She realized now, with a strange and dizzying clarity, that she had never truly been alone at all. While she had endured the Duke's cruelty in silence, believing herself powerless and friendless, an entire household had been quietly working, at great risk to themselves, to make certain she would never have to endure it forever. "Why," she asked without turning around, "would any of you risk so much for me? If the Duke discovered what you had done, he could dismiss you all without reference. He could ruin you." Margaret was quiet for a moment before answering. "Because none of us could bear to watch you endure another year of it, ma'am. Because you have never once been unkind to any of us, not in 3 years, even when he made certain everyone in this house understood you were beneath his notice. And because," she added, her voice growing firmer, "there comes a point where watching cruelty happen and doing nothing becomes its own kind of wrong." Elinor turned back from the window, wiping quickly at her eyes. "Then I will not let your risk be wasted. Tell me what I must do." It was decided that night that the household could wait no longer than 3 days. The bishop's clerk was expected to arrive at Morland Hall within the week to begin the formal process of setting aside the marriage, and once that process began in earnest, the Duke would almost certainly place Elinor under closer watch, perhaps even restrict her movement within the house itself, until matters were settled entirely to his satisfaction. 3 days, Margaret and Oliver agreed, was the longest the household dared to wait. The following morning brought a test of nerve that none of them had anticipated so soon. The Duke, in unusually good spirits, announced at breakfast that the bishop's clerk had sent word ahead, and would be arriving that very afternoon rather than at the end of the week as originally planned, eager, he said with a satisfied smile, to see the matter settled quickly and cleanly. Elinor felt the floor seem to tilt beneath her at the news, though she forced her face to remain calm, forced her hands to remain steady around her teacup, forced herself to nod along as though the announcement meant nothing at all to her. She had learned, over 3 years, how to hide her feelings behind a mask of quiet indifference, and she had never been more grateful for that hard-learned skill than she was in that single terrifying moment. "You seem unmoved by the news, my dear," the Duke observed, watching her over the rim of his own cup with something like curiosity in his eyes. "I have long understood my place in this house, Edmund," Elinor replied evenly, using the calm, resigned tone she had perfected over years of similar conversations. "Whatever arrangement you believe is best, I trust you have considered it thoroughly." The Duke seemed pleased by this response, and he returned to his breakfast without further comment, entirely unaware of the storm of fear and determination churning beneath his wife's composed exterior. Elinor excused herself as soon as she reasonably could, and hurried to find Margaret, who had already heard the news from Charles and was waiting for her in the small sitting room with a face full of grim resolve. "We cannot wait 3 days," Elinor said the moment the door was closed. "The clerk arrives this afternoon." "Then we do not wait 3 days," Margaret answered, her voice steady despite the fear Elinor could see plainly in her eyes. "We move tonight." The word tonight seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with everything it meant, danger and hope tangled together so tightly that neither woman could easily separate the two. Outside, the household continued its ordinary rhythm, servants polishing silver, maids preparing the guest rooms for the clerk's expected visit, the entire house moving through its usual routines with no outward sign of the desperate, urgent plan now racing to completion within its walls. But behind closed doors, in hurried whispers exchanged in hallways and kitchens throughout that long and anxious day, word passed quickly among the small group who had committed themselves to Elinor's escape. Oliver would have the carriage ready and waiting in the old orchard beyond the stable yard, out of sight of the main house, by the time the clock struck midnight. Alice would help Elinor slip quietly from her chamber while the rest of the household slept. Charles would keep careful watch near the servants' entrance, ready to warn the others of any unexpected movement. And Margaret, who had begun this entire quiet rebellion weeks earlier with nothing more than a letter and a hidden trunk, would remain behind in the house, ready to face whatever consequences might follow, so long as Elinor herself made it safely away before the sun rose over Morland Hall the next morning. The clerk arrived precisely on schedule that afternoon, a thin, serious man with ink-stained fingers and a leather case full of papers, and Elinor sat through the required introductions and polite conversation with a composure that surprised even herself, knowing that within hours, if all went well, she would never have to sit at this table again. She caught Margaret's eye once during the long, tense afternoon, a brief glance across the drawing room that carried within it an entire unspoken conversation, courage exchanged silently between two women who understood, better than anyone else in that grand and gilded house, exactly what the coming night would demand of them both. Dinner that evening felt longer than any Elinor had endured in her 3 years at Morland Hall, though in truth it lasted no more than the usual hour. The clerk sat at the Duke's right hand, discussing legal matters in low, careful tones that Elinor forced herself not to listen to too closely, afraid that her composure might crack if she understood too clearly the exact words being used to erase her from this house, as though she had never belonged there at all. The Duke was in excellent humor, refilling the clerk's glass himself, laughing easily at small jokes, glancing occasionally toward Elinor with an expression that held no malice tonight, only a distant, careless satisfaction, as though he were already looking past her toward the future he had planned for himself. She realized, watching him across the table, that he did not even feel the need to mock her tonight. He had already won in his own mind. There was no sport left in tormenting a woman he considered already defeated. She excused herself earlier than usual, pleading a headache that was not entirely a lie, and made her way up the grand staircase with slow, measured steps, aware that Grimshaw stood near the base of the stairs, watching her ascent with his usual quiet, unreadable attention. She did not let her pace change. She did not let her hands tremble where he might see them. She simply climbed the stairs as she had climbed them 1,000 times before, an unremarkable woman retiring early from an unremarkable evening. Once safely inside her chamber with the door closed behind her, however, her calm broke apart entirely. Her hands shook as she pressed them against her mouth to keep from making a sound, her whole body flooding with a fear so sharp it left her briefly unable to move. Tonight. It would happen tonight in only a few hours, and if anything at all went wrong, if Grimshaw noticed something, if the Duke changed his habits and stayed awake later than usual, if the carriage could not be readied in time, everything Margaret and the others had risked so much to build would collapse, and Elinor would be left facing the clerk's papers tomorrow with no hope of escape remaining. A soft knock came at the door a short while later, 3 careful taps followed by a pause, the signal Margaret had arranged earlier that day. Elinor opened the door quickly to find Alice standing in the dim hallway, a small bundle of dark clothing folded over one arm and an expression of fierce, quiet determination on her young face. "It is time to change, ma'am," Alice whispered, slipping inside and closing the door softly behind her. "Something plain, nothing that would catch a lantern's light too easily. I have brought a traveling dress from the trunk." Elinor changed quickly with Alice's help, her fine evening gown replaced with a simple, dark wool dress meant for travel rather than display, her elaborate hairpins removed, and her hair braided close against her head beneath a plain bonnet that Alice produced from beneath her own apron. Looking at herself in the small mirror above her washstand, Elinor barely recognized the woman staring back at her, and she felt, strangely, a small flicker of something like relief at the sight, as though shedding the fine clothes of a duchess she had never truly wanted to be was itself the first true step toward freedom. "Margaret says we must wait until the house has settled fully," Alice explained in a hushed voice, glancing toward the door as though the wood itself might betray them. "The Duke usually retires by 11, and Mr. Grimshaw makes his final rounds shortly after midnight." We must be past the servants' entrance and into the orchard before he begins his walk, or we risk crossing his path entirely." Elinor nodded, forcing herself to breathe slowly, steadily, though her heart raced painfully against her ribs. And the trunk, already carried down and hidden near the old well behind the kitchen garden. Charles managed it an hour ago while the house was still busy with dinner. Oliver will collect it on the way to the orchard. The two women sat together in near silence for the better part of an hour, Alice keeping careful watch at the door while Elinor tried, without much success, to steady the wild rush of thoughts and fears racing through her mind. She thought of the Duke, laughing at his own joke only days before, so certain of her helplessness that he had never once considered the possibility of resistance forming right beneath his own roof. She thought of Margaret's kind, weathered face, of the risk the older woman was taking simply by helping her, of Oliver's quiet loyalty and Charles's careful watchfulness and Alice's trembling courage, all of it given freely to a woman who had believed, until only a few days ago, that she had no one in the world at all. Shortly after midnight, a second soft knock came at the door, and this time it was Margaret herself who slipped inside, her face pale but composed in the flickering candlelight. "The Duke has retired," she whispered. "Grimshaw has just begun his rounds on the ground floor. We have perhaps 20 minutes before he reaches this side of the house. It must be now." Elinor rose immediately, her legs feeling strangely unsteady beneath her despite the calm she tried to project. "I am ready." Margaret reached out and took both of Elinor's hands in her own, holding them tightly for a brief moment. "You have been a credit to this house since the day you arrived, ma'am, whatever the Duke may have said or believed. I am only sorry it took us so long to find the courage to do what should have been done long before now. You have given me more than courage tonight, Margaret. You have given me a future I believed I no longer possessed." Elinor's voice caught slightly, but she steadied it quickly, aware of the precious minutes slipping away even as they spoke. "I will not forget this, any of it." There was no more time for words after that. Margaret led the way into the darkened hallway, moving with the quiet familiarity of a woman who had walked these corridors for 20 years and knew every creaking floorboard by memory, guiding Elinor and Alice down a narrow back staircase, rarely used by anyone but the household staff, past the silent kitchens, where the last of the evening's fires had been banked down to glowing embers, and toward the small servants' entrance at the rear of the house. Charles waited there already, holding the door open just enough to allow them through without letting the hinges creak, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond for any sign of movement. "The path is clear," he whispered, "but we must hurry. I saw Grimshaw's lantern near the east wing, not 5 minutes past." The cold night air struck Elinor the moment she stepped outside, sharp and bracing after the warmth of the house, and she pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders as Margaret led the small group swiftly across the dark kitchen garden, keeping close to the shadow of the high stone wall that bordered the property. Somewhere behind them, faint and distant, Elinor thought she heard the soft sound of a door opening, and her heart lurched painfully in her chest. But when she glanced back, she saw nothing but darkness and the black silhouette of the great house rising silently against the night sky. They reached the old well near the edge of the kitchen garden, where the small leather trunk sat waiting exactly where Charles had left it earlier that evening, and Margaret bent quickly to help him lift it between them, moving as fast as the awkward weight allowed toward the gap in the hedge that led out into the orchard beyond. It was there, in the deep shadow of the apple trees, that Elinor first heard the soft, familiar creak of carriage wheels, and a moment later she saw the shape of it emerging from the darkness, Oliver Finch seated calmly at the reins, the horses shifting restlessly in the cold night air, ready and waiting to carry her away from the only life she had known for the past 3 years. But even as relief began to rise in her chest at the sight of the waiting carriage, a new and sudden sound reached her ears from somewhere back near the house, a sharp voice calling out into the darkness, followed almost immediately by the unmistakable glow of a lantern swinging rapidly toward the garden gate. "Someone is there," the voice called, cold and clear across the still night air, and Elinor recognized it at once as belonging to Walter Grimshaw. For one terrible instant, no one in the small group moved at all. The lantern light swung wildly across the garden wall, throwing long, jagged shadows over the hedges, and Alina felt her entire body go rigid with fear, certain that everything they had built over these past weeks was about to collapse in a single, terrible moment. It was Charles who reacted first. He turned sharply toward the sound of Grimshaw's voice and called back across the darkness in a tone that carried none of the panic tightening every muscle in his own chest. "Only me, Mr. Grimshaw. I heard a noise near the stable and came to check it myself." There was a pause, long enough that Alina thought her heart might simply stop beating altogether while she waited for it to end. Then Grimshaw's voice came again, closer now, edged with suspicion. "At this hour, what noise would call a footman from his bed at midnight?" "A fox, sir, most likely, going after the hens. I heard the coop rattling and thought it best to look before the birds were lost." Charles's voice remained remarkably steady, and Alina, crouched low in the shadow of the apple trees with Alice's trembling hand gripping her own, marveled silently at the calm courage the young footman was managing to summon in a moment that would have broken the nerve of many braver men. The lantern light drew nearer still, and through the gaps in the hedge Alina could see the tall, thin shape of Grimshaw approaching the garden gate, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness with the same careful, searching attention he had shown outside the storage room days before. Margaret, beside her, had gone utterly still, one hand pressed flat against the trunk as though sheer stillness alone might render them all invisible. "Show me this coop, then," Grimshaw said, his voice carrying an edge that suggested he did not entirely believe the explanation he had been given. "I would not want word reaching the Duke that his hens were lost to carelessness." "Of course, sir. This way." Charles's footsteps moved away from the hedge, drawing Grimshaw's attention with him toward the henhouse on the far side of the stable yard, deliberately leading the steward's suspicion away from the orchard and the small, frightened group hidden within its shadows. Margaret waited until the sound of their footsteps had faded almost entirely before daring to move again, and even then she moved with excruciating slowness, guiding Alina and Alice, the final few steps toward the waiting carriage with a caution that made every second feel impossibly long. Oliver, who had watched the entire exchange from his seat with his hand resting tensely on the reins, let out a slow breath as they finally reached the carriage door. "That was closer than I would have liked," he murmured, helping Margaret lift the trunk up onto the back of the carriage as quietly as the awkward wait allowed. "We cannot delay any further. If Grimshaw returns this way before we are clear of the grounds, no excuse will save us a second time." Alina climbed into the dark interior of the carriage, her hands still trembling from the fear that had gripped her only moments before, and Alice climbed in swiftly behind her, settling onto the narrow bench with a soft, relieved exhale. Margaret remained standing beside the open door, and for a brief moment the two women looked at one another in the darkness, neither quite able to find the words the moment seemed to demand. "Go now," Margaret said finally, her voice thick with an emotion she had kept carefully hidden throughout the long, tense evening. "Before the sun rises and the whole house wakes to find you missing. Write to me when you are safely settled, if you are able, though be careful how you send it." "I will never be able to repay what you have done for me tonight," Alina said, reaching out to grip Margaret's hand tightly through the open carriage door. "Any of you. You owe us nothing but a good life, ma'am, lived far away from this house and the man who never deserved you in it. That will be repayment enough." Margaret squeezed her hand once, then stepped back from the carriage, nodding to Oliver, who gathered the reins and urged the horses forward into a careful, quiet walk, guiding them along the narrow track that ran behind the orchard toward the small side gate that opened onto the western road, the same lesser-used route he had scouted carefully in the days before. The carriage rolled slowly at first, wheels muffled by the soft earth of the orchard path, and Alina sat pressed close to the small window, watching the dark shape of Morland Hall recede gradually behind them, its windows dark except for a single faint light burning somewhere on the ground floor, likely Grimshaw's lantern still moving through the stable yard in search of a fox that did not exist. They passed through the side gate without incident, Oliver having oiled its hinges himself 2 nights before to ensure it would open silently. And once the carriage reached the open road beyond the estate walls, he urged the horses into a faster pace, the wheels finally striking a steady, confident rhythm against the packed earth, as Morland Hall disappeared entirely into the darkness behind them. For a long while, none of the 3 occupants of the carriage spoke at all. Alice sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring out at the passing darkness with an expression somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief that they had actually succeeded. Elinor kept her eyes fixed on the small window, watching the shapes of trees and hedgerows slip past in the moonlight, feeling something inside her chest that she could not immediately name, a strange mixture of terror and relief so tangled together that she hardly knew which feeling to trust. It was Alice who finally broke the silence, her young voice hushed but no longer trembling with quite the same fear it had carried only an hour before. "Do you truly believe we are safe now, ma'am?" "I do not know," Elinor admitted honestly. "But I believe we are safer tonight than I have felt in 3 years, and for now, I think that must be enough." The carriage continued west through the night, following the quieter road Oliver had chosen specifically to avoid the coaching inns and toll gates where word of a fleeing duchess might travel quickly back toward Morland Hall. He drove with careful, practiced skill, slowing the horses whenever the road grew rough or uncertain in the darkness, pushing them faster along the smoother stretches where the moonlight gave enough light to see clearly ahead. As the first pale hints of dawn began to touch the eastern sky behind them, Oliver finally drew the carriage to a halt beside a small stream that crossed the road, allowing the tired horses a brief rest and a chance to drink before continuing the long journey ahead. Elinor stepped down from the carriage to stretch her stiff limbs, and for the first time since leaving Morland Hall, she allowed herself to truly look at the world around her. The pale gray light spreading slowly across unfamiliar fields, the quiet stillness of a countryside she had never before had reason to see. "How much further to Mrs. Ashworth's home?" she asked, watching Oliver check the horses' harnesses with careful attention. 2 days' travel at this pace, perhaps a day and a half if the roads remain clear and dry. Oliver straightened and glanced toward the horizon, calculating silently. "We will need to stop somewhere safe tonight to rest the horses properly, but I know a small inn along this road, run by a family who owes me a favor from years past. They will ask no questions and keep no records that anyone from Morland Hall would think to search." Elinor nodded, grateful once again for the careful planning that had gone into every part of this daring escape, planning she had known nothing about until Margaret's confession only days before. Planning that had likely saved her from a future far darker than anything she had imagined even at her lowest moments within those grand, cold walls. They continued on shortly after, the morning light growing steadily stronger around them, and Elinor found herself, despite the exhaustion pressing heavily against her eyes, unable to look away from the passing countryside, drinking in the sight of it as though she were seeing the world itself for the very first time. Every mile that passed beneath the carriage wheels carried her further from the Duke of Morland and the cruel, careless laughter that had defined her existence for 3 long years. And though the uncertain future ahead still frightened her in ways she could not fully name, she found, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that the fear no longer outweighed the hope rising steadily alongside it. Back at Morland Hall, the household stirred slowly into its usual morning routine, servants lighting fires and preparing breakfast trays with the same practiced efficiency as every other day, betraying nothing of the extraordinary events that had unfolded beneath the same roof only hours before. Margaret moved through the kitchen with deliberate calm, giving instructions in her usual measured tone, though her mind remained fixed on the carriage rolling steadily westward, praying silently that Oliver's careful planning would carry Elinor safely to her journey's end. It was nearly 9 o'clock when the Duke of Morland finally rang for his valet, expecting, as he did every morning, for his day to unfold exactly as he intended it. He had no reason yet to suspect that anything at all had changed within his household overnight, no reason to imagine that the quiet, defeated woman he had mocked so freely at his own dinner table was, at that very moment, riding steadily away from him along a country road he had never once thought to watch. He would not remain in such comfortable ignorance for very much longer. The Duke of Morland's morning began to unravel shortly after 10 o'clock, when his valet knocked at Aline's chamber door to inform her that breakfast had been laid and found, to his confusion, that the room stood empty. The bed, neatly made in a way that suggested it, had not been slept in at all the night before. The valet, a cautious man who understood the wisdom of confirming facts before troubling his master with uncertain news, made a quick search of the small sitting room Aline favored, the gardens where she often walked in the early morning hours, and even the library, before finally accepting that the Duchess of Morland was nowhere to be found within the house. He delivered this news to the Duke with visible reluctance, and for a moment the Duke simply stared at him as though the words made no sense at all, as though the very idea of Aline's absence were too absurd to be taken seriously. "Nowhere to be found," the Duke repeated slowly. "What do you mean, nowhere to be found? She has not left the grounds in 3 years without my knowledge. Where would she go?" The question, spoken now in genuine confusion rather than mocking amusement, carried none of the careless humor it had held at the dinner table only a week before. The Duke rose from his chair with sudden, sharp irritation, and strode from the room, calling loudly for Grimshaw, for the housekeeper, for anyone in the household who might explain how such a thing could possibly have happened beneath his own roof without his knowledge. Margaret was summoned within minutes, and she presented herself before the Duke with an expression of careful, practiced surprise that she had rehearsed silently in her mind a dozen times over the past several days, anticipating exactly this moment. "I could not say, Your Grace," she answered calmly, when he demanded to know where his wife had gone. "I saw her retire early last evening, complaining of a headache, and assumed she had simply slept later than usual this morning." "Her bed was untouched," the Duke snapped, pacing the length of his study with barely controlled fury. "Someone in this house must know something. Servants notice everything. It is the one talent I have ever credited you people with possessing." Margaret kept her face carefully neutral despite the sharp insult buried within his words, an insult she had absorbed countless times before on Aline's behalf, and had long ago learned to let pass without visible reaction. "I will ask among the staff at once, Your Grace, though I confess I cannot imagine where she might have gone. She has no family nearby, no friends she visits, no means of travel that I am aware of." The Duke's pacing slowed slightly at this, some of his anger giving way, briefly, to genuine bewilderment. It was, Margaret realized with a small flicker of dark satisfaction, the very same argument he had used so often to mock Aline's helplessness now working quietly against him, feeding his confusion precisely, because he had never once imagined her capable of arranging her own escape. Grimshaw arrived shortly after, having conducted his own hurried search of the grounds, and reported that the stables showed one horse and carriage missing along with the young driver Oliver Finch, a detail that finally shifted the Duke's confusion into something colder and far more dangerous. "The carriage," the Duke said slowly, understanding dawning across his face in a way that made Margaret's stomach tighten with fear despite her outward composure. "She has taken the carriage. Someone helped her. Someone in this house helped my wife escape in the middle of the night, and I want to know who." What followed was a long and difficult morning throughout Morland Hall, as the Duke summoned member after member of the household staff into his study, questioning each of them sharply about their movements the previous evening, watching their faces with the same suspicious intensity Grimshaw usually reserved for his own quiet investigations. Charles was questioned closely about the disturbance in the henhouse the night before, and he held to his story with the same steady calm he had shown Grimshaw in the darkness of the garden, insisting he had heard nothing more than a fox disturbing the hens, and had returned to his bed shortly after checking the coop. Alice, questioned separately, claimed she had retired early with a headache of her own and knew nothing of the Duchess's whereabouts, her voice trembling only slightly, A tremor the Duke seemed to attribute to simple nervousness at being questioned by his own hand rather than to any deeper guilt. By early afternoon, the Duke had gathered no clear answers, only a growing, simmering fury that Alina, a woman he had spent years dismissing as helpless and dependent, had somehow managed to vanish from his house entirely without his knowledge, taking with her his carriage, his driver, and though he did not yet fully grasp this final detail, his own careless assumptions about exactly how much power she had truly held all along. He sent riders out along the main roads that afternoon, instructing them to inquire at coaching inns and toll gates for any sign of a carriage matching the description of his own. But the roads they searched were the obvious ones, the well-traveled routes any sensible person might expect a fleeing woman to take, and none of them thought to search the quieter western road that Oliver had chosen with such careful deliberation days before. Meanwhile, some 50 miles distant, Alina sat in the small, warm kitchen of the country inn Oliver had promised would ask no questions, sharing a simple meal with Alice while Oliver saw to the horses in the stable outside. The innkeeper, a broad, kind-faced woman named Dorothy who had indeed known Oliver's family for many years, had welcomed them without a single question about their journey or their destination, simply showing them to a small, clean room upstairs and promising a good breakfast before they continued on their way the next morning. It was there, over the quiet warmth of the kitchen fire, that Alina finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of everything that had happened, the fear of the night before mixing now with an exhaustion so complete it left her hands trembling slightly around her teacup. "Do you think he has discovered you are gone by now?" Alice asked quietly, watching Alina's face with careful concern. "I imagine he has," Alina answered, staring into the fire. "I imagine he is furious and confused and entirely unable to understand how a woman he believed had nowhere in the world to go could possibly have simply left. Are you frightened he will find us?" Alina considered the question seriously before answering, aware that Alice deserved an honest response after everything the young maid had risked to help her reach this point. "A little, yes, but less frightened than I was this time yesterday, sitting in that house believing my future had already been decided for me by a man who never once considered what I might want for myself." She reached across the small table and squeezed Alice's hand gently. "Whatever happens next, I am grateful beyond words that I am facing it as a free woman, rather than the quiet, resigned wife I was only a day ago." That night, as Alina lay in the narrow but comfortable bed of the small country inn, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a house that was not Morland Hall settling into sleep around her, she found her mind returning again and again to the moment Margaret had first knocked on her chamber door, carrying with her the terrible knowledge of the Duke's plan and the extraordinary secret of the trunk hidden above her head for weeks without her knowledge. She thought of how close she had come to losing everything without ever knowing a fight had been fought on her behalf. She thought of Charles's steady voice in the darkness, drawing Grimshaw's suspicion away from the orchard with nothing more than quick thinking and quiet courage. She thought of Oliver's careful planning, of every mile of road he had studied and memorized in secret, preparing for a journey he hoped desperately would never be needed too urgently, only to have that very need arrive far sooner than any of them expected. And she thought, finally, of the choice that now lay entirely before her for the first time in years, the choice of what kind of life she wished to build once she reached Constance Ashworth's quiet home in the north, free at last from a man who had spent 3 years convincing her, and everyone who witnessed his cruelty, that she possessed no value beyond his willingness to keep her. She fell asleep that night with a strange, fragile sense of peace settling over her, the first peaceful sleep she had known in longer than she cared to remember, and she did not wake until Dorothy's gentle knock at the door announced that breakfast was ready and the road north still waited to be traveled. They set out again shortly after dawn, the horses rested, and the morning air crisp and clear around them, and though Alina knew the danger of pursuit had not entirely passed, she found, as the carriage rolled steadily onward through the awakening countryside, that her fear had begun, slowly but surely, to give way to something far stronger and far more valuable than the courage it had taken merely to survive within the Duke's cold house for 3 long years. It was the quiet, steady courage required to finally choose, for the very first time in her adult life, exactly where she wished to go. The second day of travel brought them within reach of the market town, where Constance Ashworth kept her quiet home, and it should have been, by every reasonable measure, the easiest stretch of the entire journey. The road had grown smoother as they traveled further from moorland lands. The weather remained clear and mild, and Oliver's careful planning had so far kept them entirely clear of any sign that the Duke's search had come anywhere close to discovering their true path. It was for exactly this reason that none of them expected trouble so close to their destination. And it was for exactly this reason that the sight of two riders approaching swiftly from behind, their horses moving at a hard, determined pace along the same quiet western road Oliver had chosen so carefully, struck fear into all three travelers with a suddenness that left little time for careful thought. Oliver noticed them first, glancing back over his shoulder at the sound of rapid hoofbeats drawing steadily nearer, and his face, when Alina caught sight of it through the small carriage window, had gone tight with an alarm he could not entirely hide. "Riders," he called down, his voice tense but controlled. "Moving fast and gaining on us." Alina's heart lurched painfully in her chest. Could it be the Duke's men? "I do not know, but I do not intend to wait and find out at close range." Oliver urged the horses forward into a faster pace, the carriage jolting roughly over the packed dirt road as the wheels struck a rhythm far quicker than the careful, steady pace he had maintained throughout the journey thus far. Alice gripped Alina's hand tightly as the carriage rocked and swayed around them. Both women pressed back against their seats as the horses' hooves thundered against the road beneath them. Alina risked a glance through the small rear window and felt her stomach drop at the sight of the two riders, still distant but unmistakably closing the gap between them, their horses far faster and less burdened than the carriage struggling to outrun them. "They are gaining," she said, her voice tight with fear. Oliver said nothing, focusing every ounce of his attention on the road ahead, guiding the straining horses around a sharp bend, where the road dipped down toward a narrow stone bridge crossing a shallow river. It was there, at the bridge, that their pursuers finally drew close enough for Alina to make out their faces clearly through the small window, and her fear shifted suddenly into something closer to bewildered relief, as she recognized neither man as belonging to the Duke's household at all. They were simply two local farmers, she realized as the riders finally overtook the carriage and continued past it entirely without so much as a curious glance toward its occupants, racing ahead toward the market town for reasons entirely unrelated to Alina's desperate flight, likely hurrying to reach the town before some shop or market closed for the evening. Oliver slowed the horses gradually once the riders had disappeared around the bend ahead, and the carriage settled back into its steadier pace, though Alina's heart continued to pound painfully for several long minutes afterward, her body slow to accept what her mind already understood, that the danger had passed as quickly and harmlessly as it had appeared. "I am sorry," Oliver called down once the horses had calmed. "I did not want to take the chance of waiting to find out who they truly were, not this close to the end of our journey." "You were right to be cautious," Alina answered, though her voice still trembled slightly with the fading rush of fear. "I would rather race needlessly from harmless travelers than risk discovering too late that they were something far more dangerous." They reached the outskirts of the market town within the hour, and Alina felt an entirely different kind of nervousness settle over her, as the carriage rolled through unfamiliar streets lined with small shops and modest houses, so different from the grand, cold architecture of Morland Hall that had surrounded her for the past 3 years. Oliver guided the horses confidently through the town, following directions Margaret had included in her careful letters, until finally the carriage drew to a stop outside a neat, modest house with a small garden bordered by a low wooden fence, exactly as Constance Ashworth had described it in her own reply weeks before. Alina stepped down from the carriage on legs still unsteady from the long journey, staring up at the house that would, if all continued to go well, become her new home, at least for the foreseeable future. Before she could gather the courage to approach the front door, however, it opened on its own, revealing a woman of perhaps 50 years, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing an expression that shifted rapidly from cautious curiosity to warm, immediate recognition. "Eleanor," the woman said, her voice thick with emotion as she hurried down the short garden path. "My dear girl, you look exactly like your mother did at your age, though I confess I hoped never to see that particular resemblance carry quite so much weariness in her eyes." "Mrs. Ashworth," Eleanor managed, her own voice catching unexpectedly as the older woman reached her and pulled her into a firm, warm embrace entirely unlike anything she had experienced within the cold formality of Morland Hall. "Thank you for taking me in when you barely know me at all." "Nonsense. You are family, whatever distance and time may have separated us until now, and family always has a place in this house." Constance pulled back to study Eleanor's face carefully, her sharp eyes missing nothing of the exhaustion and lingering fear still visible there. "Come inside, all of you. You must be exhausted from the road, and I imagine there is a great deal to discuss." Over the following hours, settled comfortably around Constance's kitchen table with warm food and stronger tea than Eleanor had tasted in years, the full story finally emerged: the Duke's cruelty, the household's quiet conspiracy, the frightening near-miss with Grimshaw in the garden, and the long, tense journey that had finally brought them safely to this quiet, welcoming home. Constance listened without interruption, her expression growing steadily darker with anger on Eleanor's behalf as the details unfolded, until finally, when Eleanor finished speaking, the older woman reached across the table and took her hand firmly. "You will stay here as long as you wish, Eleanor, and longer still if you need it. I have more space in this house than I know what to do with, and frankly, I have been rather lonely since my own husband passed. Your company would be a gift, not a burden, whatever foolish nonsense that man ever led you to believe about your own worth." Oliver and Alice remained in the town only long enough to rest the horses properly before beginning the return journey to Morland Hall the next morning, aware that their prolonged absence would only invite further suspicion from the Duke and put Margaret and Charles at greater risk than they already faced. The farewell between the three travelers who had shared such a dangerous and remarkable journey together was brief but heartfelt, filled with quiet gratitude that words could only partly express. "Take care of yourself, ma'am," Alice said, embracing Eleanor tightly before climbing back into the carriage. "And write to Margaret when you are able. She will worry terribly until she knows for certain that you arrived safely." "I will write the very moment it is safe to do so," Eleanor promised, watching as Oliver gathered the reins and prepared to guide the carriage back onto the long road toward Morland Hall and whatever uncertain reception awaited them there. She stood in Constance's small garden long after the carriage had disappeared from sight, watching the empty road with a strange mixture of gratitude and worry, hoping fiercely that the household she had left behind would face no serious consequence for the extraordinary risk they had taken on her behalf. It was Constance's gentle hand on her shoulder that finally drew her back inside, guiding her toward the warm, welcoming house that would now, for the first time in 3 difficult years, be a place Eleanor could genuinely call her own. Back at Morland Hall, the Duke's fury had only grown sharper in the days following Eleanor's disappearance, his searches along the main roads yielding nothing but frustrated dead ends, his questioning of the household staff producing no confession, despite his mounting suspicion that someone beneath his own roof had orchestrated the entire escape. He had no way of knowing, as he paced the halls of his grand and increasingly hollow-feeling house, that the answer to his fury lay not in some distant coaching inn or border crossing, but in the quiet, steady loyalty of servants he had spent years dismissing as beneath his notice, people who had watched his cruelty for far too long and had finally, together, decided to do something about it. 3 weeks after Eleanor's arrival at Constance Ashworth's home, a letter arrived that would change the course of everything that followed. It came not from Margaret, though her careful, coded letters had already reached Eleanor twice since her escape, confirming that the Duke's suspicion had settled on no one in particular, and that the household remained, for now, safely beyond serious consequence. This letter came instead from a solicitor named George Ashford, an old friend of Eleanor's late father, whom Constance had quietly contacted on Eleanor's behalf shortly after her arrival. Mr. Ashford had taken a keen and immediate interest in Eleanor's situation once he understood the full details of the Duke's plan, and his letter arrived carrying news that Eleanor read twice through before she fully allowed herself to believe it. The Duke's scheme to have the marriage quietly set aside, he explained in careful legal language, had been built upon a false claim regarding the original circumstances of the marriage, a claim that, if pursued through proper legal channels, would not only fail to grant the Duke his desired annulment, but would expose his own conduct to serious scrutiny, given that he had already begun making private arrangements to marry Caroline Redfern before any legal separation had been formally granted. In simpler terms, Mr. Ashford explained, the Duke had moved so quickly and so carelessly in his eagerness to discard Eleanor that he had, in his arrogance, created a legal trap for himself, one that could see his intended second marriage declared entirely invalid, and his own reputation, the very thing he valued above all else, badly damaged should the details ever become public. Eleanor sat with the letter in her lap for a long while after reading it, staring out the window of Constance's small but comfortable sitting room, turning the news over carefully in her mind. She thought of the Duke's laughter at that final dinner, his careless certainty that she possessed no power at all within their unequal marriage, and she felt, for the first time since her escape, something other than fear or relief rising within her. She felt, quietly and unexpectedly, the stirrings of her own quiet strength. "You could ruin him," Constance observed, reading the letter over Eleanor's shoulder with an expression of grim satisfaction. "If Mr. Ashford is correct, you hold far more power in this situation than that arrogant man ever imagined." "I do not wish to ruin him," Eleanor said slowly, considering her words carefully. "I only wish to be free of him, fairly and completely, without further cruelty or scandal following me for the rest of my life." "Then perhaps," Constance suggested, "you might use this knowledge not to destroy him, but to secure exactly the freedom and fairness you deserve on your own terms for the very first time." It was this approach that Eleanor ultimately chose, working closely with Mr. Ashford over the following weeks to draft a careful legal response to the Duke's scheme, one that made clear, in precise and unemotional language, that any attempt to proceed with his planned annulment on false grounds would be challenged immediately and publicly, exposing his reckless haste and his intended bigamous marriage to Caroline Redfern for all society to see. In exchange, the letter offered the Duke a simple and far less scandalous alternative, a proper and mutually agreed separation, arranged quietly and legally, granting Eleanor a fair and independent settlement befitting her original position as his wife, in return for her silence regarding the full and embarrassing truth of his failed scheme. The letter reached Morland Hall on a gray autumn morning, and Margaret, who happened to be present in the front hall when it arrived, watched the Duke's face carefully as he read through its contents in his study, the door left carelessly ajar in his distraction. She saw his expression shift slowly from confusion to disbelief, to something closer to genuine alarm, the color draining visibly from his face as he reached the letter's final paragraphs, and understood, at last, exactly how thoroughly his own careless arrogance had undone him. He summoned his solicitor again that very afternoon, and the conversations that followed over the coming days carried none of the confident, satisfied tone that had marked his earlier discussions regarding Eleanor's removal from his life. Faced with the very real possibility of public scandal, of his planned marriage to Caroline Redfern being exposed as reckless bigamy before it had even properly begun, the Duke of Morland found himself, for perhaps the first time in his privileged life, forced to negotiate rather than simply command. The settlement was finalized within the month, granting Eleanor a fair and independent income, full and legal separation from the Duke without any further attempt to falsely annul their marriage, and complete freedom to live her life exactly as she chose, far from Morland Hall and the man who had once found such easy amusement in her apparent helplessness. News of the settlement reached Eleanor through a brief, carefully worded letter from Mr. Ashford, and she read it standing in Constance's small garden, the autumn sun warm against her face, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders that she had carried for so long she had nearly forgotten what its absence might feel like. She wrote to Margaret that same evening, sharing the news and expressing, once again, her deep and lasting gratitude for everything the household had risked on her behalf. Margaret's reply arrived a week later, filled with quiet joy at Aline's newfound freedom, and a small piece of additional news that made Aline laugh aloud for the first time in longer than she could remember. The Duke, Margaret wrote, had grown noticeably quieter around the dinner table in recent weeks, his famous laughter conspicuously absent, his guests reduced in number as word of his failed scheme and hasty settlement began, despite his best efforts, to circulate quietly through certain social circles. Caroline Redfern, it seemed, had grown considerably cooler toward the prospect of marriage once the details of the Duke's earlier conduct reached her own family, and the engagement Margaret had once feared would proceed quickly and quietly had instead been indefinitely delayed. Aline felt no particular satisfaction in the Duke's discomfort, no desire for revenge against a man who, whatever his cruelty, no longer held any power over her future. What she felt instead, reading Margaret's careful account of the household's continued small triumphs, was simply a quiet, settled sense of justice finally served, not through anger or scandal deliberately sought, but through the simple, unavoidable consequences of a man's own careless arrogance finally catching up with him. Life in Constance Ashworth's quiet market town settlement continued to unfold gently over the following months. Aline found, to her genuine surprise, a natural talent for the small charitable work Constance had long overseen within the local community, organizing support for widows and orphaned children left without resources, work that gave her days a purpose and satisfaction she had never once experienced within the empty, gilded rooms of Morland Hall. She began also in quiet moments to write small essays at first, reflections on kindness and cruelty and the quiet strength found in unexpected places. Essays that Constance, without asking permission, eventually submitted to a small local publication, where they found a modest but appreciative readership. She corresponded regularly with Margaret, and eventually, once enough time had passed that the risk felt manageable, arranged a quiet visit from Alice, who traveled north during a rare stretch of leave from her position, and spent a joyful week exploring the market town with Aline, marveling at how completely different, how much lighter and freer, her former mistress seemed in this new, chosen life. It was nearly a year after her escape from Morland Hall that Aline received word, through Margaret's careful letters, that the Duke had finally abandoned his pursuit of Caroline Redfern entirely, the young woman's family having quietly withdrawn their support for the match, once his reputation suffered further damage from continued whispers about his failed scheme. He remained at Morland Hall, Margaret reported, increasingly isolated, his dinner parties smaller and less frequent, his famous laughter rarely heard echoing through those grand, cold halls any longer. Aline read this news with a strange, quiet clarity, understanding finally, perhaps for the first time, the full weight of everything that had happened since that terrible night at the dinner table when the Duke had laughed so carelessly at the question that had once defined her entire existence. Where would she go? He had asked it as a joke, certain of the answer, certain that a woman with no family, no fortune, and no visible resources possessed no options at all beyond his own reluctant charity. He had never imagined, in his careless arrogance, that the very household he trusted to serve him without question had been quietly, carefully, courageously answering that question all along, not with words, but with action, with a hidden trunk packed in secret, with letters written in careful hands, with a carriage readied in a moonlit orchard, and with the simple, unshakable belief that Aline Whitmore deserved a future far better than the one he had so carelessly assumed was the only one available to her. 5 years passed before Aline returned, even briefly, to the county where Morland Hall stood, and the woman who made that journey bore little resemblance to the quiet, resigned wife who had once endured the Duke's laughter in silence at his own dinner table. She traveled now not as a fleeing woman hiding beneath a plain bonnet in the back of a borrowed carriage, but as a respected and independent woman of her own means, invited to speak at a charitable gathering in a neighboring town about the very work she had built with constance over the years, supporting widows and children left without resources or protection. The invitation had come as something of a surprise, and Alina had hesitated before accepting it, aware that the journey would carry her close enough to moorland lands that she might, however unlikely, encounter someone from her old life. But Constance, now grown frail but no less sharp in her opinions, had encouraged her firmly to go. "You have spent 5 years building a life that man never believed you capable of building," Constance said, folding Alina's traveling cloak with careful hands. "There is no shame left in that county for you to fear, my dear. If anything, it is he who ought to fear encountering you." Alina found, to her own quiet surprise, that Constance's words proved entirely correct. She delivered her talk to a full and attentive room, speaking with the calm confidence she had slowly built over years of similar work, and she felt no trace of the old fear that had once defined her every waking hour within Morland Hall's cold walls. It was during that same visit that she finally saw Margaret again in person, the older woman having traveled from her new position, for she had left the Duke's service 2 years earlier, taking with her a small pension and a glowing reference secured, quietly and deliberately, through Mr. Ashford's careful legal assistance as part of the original settlement negotiations. Margaret now managed the household of a kind, an elderly baroness in a nearby town, a position far gentler and more peaceful than her many years at Morland Hall had ever offered. The two women embraced warmly outside the small hall where Alina had delivered her talk, and Margaret held her at arm's length afterward, studying her face with obvious pride. "You look well, ma'am," Margaret said, though the old title now felt more like an affectionate habit than any true reflection of hierarchy between them. "Truly well, in a way I confess I feared I might never see." "I have you to thank for that, Margaret, more than anyone else alive." Alina squeezed her hands warmly. "How is Charles and Alice?" "Charles has married and taken a position as butler in a fine house 2 counties over, quite respected in his own right now. Alice left service herself last year to marry a young shopkeeper in the very market town where you once stayed at Dorothy's Inn, if you can believe such a coincidence. She writes to me often, full of happiness." "And Oliver?" Margaret's expression softened further. "Still driving, though now for a family far kinder than the one he once served. He asks after you whenever he writes, and I know he would be glad to hear how well you have done for yourself." Alina listened to each piece of news with genuine joy, grateful beyond measure that the small, brave group who had risked so much on her behalf had each gone on to find their own measure of peace and happiness in the years since that dangerous night in the orchard. It was Margaret who finally brought up, with visible reluctance, the subject Alina had not yet dared to ask about directly. "You will want to know of him, I expect, even if only from curiosity." "Only if you feel it right to share," Alina said carefully. Margaret considered for a moment before speaking. "The Duke remains at Morland Hall, though the house feels a different place entirely now, from what I hear through old friends still in service there. His marriage to Miss Redfern never did proceed, as you know, and no other engagement has ever taken its place. He entertains far less than he once did, and those who do still accept his invitations speak of him as a changed man, quieter, more careful in his words, though whether that change comes from genuine reflection or simple fear of further scandal, I could not say with any certainty." Alina absorbed this news quietly, searching her own heart for some trace of satisfaction or lingering resentment, and found, to her mild surprise, mostly a calm and settled indifference. The Duke of Morland had once held the power to define her entire existence with a single careless laugh across a dinner table, and now, 5 years later, she found she could hear news of his diminished, lonely life without any particular feeling at all beyond a distant, faint pity for a man who had never learned to value the people around him until it was far too late to matter. "I hope," she said finally, that he finds some measure of peace eventually, whatever form that peace might take. But I confess I no longer spend much time thinking of him at all. My life has grown far too full and far too busy for that. It was true, and saying it aloud brought Elinor a satisfaction deeper than any pleasure she might have taken from news of the Duke's continued misfortune. Her days now were filled with meaningful work, with the warm companionship of Constance, who had become as dear to her as any true mother, with the growing network of friends and colleagues she had built through years of charitable service, and with the quiet, steady confidence of a woman who had finally learned, through the darkest test of her life, exactly how much strength and worth she had always possessed, even in the years when the world around her had insisted otherwise. Before returning north the following morning, Elinor made one final stop, traveling a short distance out of her way to visit the old orchard behind what had once been Morland Hall's kitchen garden, the very spot where Oliver's carriage had waited in the darkness 5 years before, where Grimshaw's lantern had swung so dangerously close to discovering their entire desperate plan. The orchard looked different in the soft light of a summer afternoon than it had in the fearful darkness of that long-ago night, the apple trees now heavy with fruit, the hedges trimmed neatly by gardeners who had no idea of the history their quiet corner of the estate had once witnessed. She stood there for a long while, remembering the terror of that night, the sound of Grimshaw's voice calling out into the darkness, the desperate relief of finally reaching the safety of the waiting carriage, and she felt, standing now in the peaceful sunlight with nothing but bird song and the gentle rustle of leaves around her, an overwhelming gratitude for every person who had made that dangerous, hopeful night possible. The Duke of Morland had once laughed at a question he believed had only one answer, certain that a woman with no family, no fortune, and no visible power possessed nowhere in the world to turn. He had asked it carelessly, cruelly, at his own table in front of guests who laughed along simply because laughing along was easier than questioning a powerful man's casual contempt. He had never imagined that the answer to his question was already being written, quietly and courageously, by the very people he trusted to serve his comfort without ever considering their own conscience. He had never imagined that a housekeeper's careful letters, a footman's calm nerve under pressure, a young maid's trembling but unwavering loyalty, and a driver's quiet, steady courage could together accomplish what he believed entirely impossible. Elinor Whitmore had gone somewhere in the end. She had gone toward a life built on her own terms, surrounded by people who valued her not for the name she carried or the fortune she lacked, but simply for the quiet strength and kindness she had shown, even in her darkest years, to everyone around her. She had gone toward purpose, toward friendship, toward a peace she had once believed entirely beyond her reach. And though the Duke of Morland never did learn the full details of exactly how his household had conspired against him that fateful night, he lived the remainder of his years with the uncomfortable, unanswered knowledge that the woman he had so carelessly mocked, the woman he had been certain possessed nowhere in the world to go, had found not just somewhere to go, but somewhere far better than anything he had ever offered her, and had found it entirely because of the quiet, unseen kindness of people he had never once thought to value at all.